Hi, my name is Heleen Pennings. I am a researcher at Utrecht University and I've studied moment-to-moment teacher-student interactions and how those are related to the teacher-student relationship. One of the aspects that I've been studying is the principle of interpersonal complementarity. And in this video I will explain more about this principle, why it is important, and how you can use it when you're teaching to improve, for example, your interactions or your relationship. Teacher-student relationships develop from interactions that occur during the lesson. More specifically, how students and teachers describe the quality of the teacher-student relationship is related to their perceptions of each other's interpersonal behavior in those interactions. Interactions between teachers and students follow a continuous action-reaction sequence. Based on daily action-reaction sequences, the teacher and students develop perceptions about each other, and this is indicative for the teacher-student relationship. Eventually, behavior and perception stabilize into a certain stable teacher-student relationship. For example, if a teacher is almost always friendly towards the students, helps the students and asks the students how they are doing, and in the meantime is also guiding the students towards positive interactions and learning, this will result in a positive atmosphere in the classroom. The more often the teacher shows this kind of behavior, the more strong the student's perception about this teacher will become. And the same holds for teachers' perceptions about the students, of course. The theory that we use to describe this kind of behavior and relationships is called interpersonal theory. To study teacher-student relationships and interactions, I've used two principles from interpersonal theory. The first principle is that every human behavior can be described by using just two uncorrelated dimensions called agency and communion. Agency refers to the degree of dominance in behavior. This dimension spans from high agency or dominance to low agency or submissiveness. Communion refers to the degree of friendliness in behavior. This dimension spans from low communion or hostility to high communion or friendliness. Because the two dimensions are uncorrelated, they together form a two-dimensional circular model. Remember the example that I provided on the previous slide, where the teacher was leading and helpful towards the students. Such a teacher has a reasonably high level of agency and communion in behavior. The behavior of this teacher would be placed in the upper right corner of the interpersonal circle. To indicate which kind of behavior is located in which part of the interpersonal circle, often 8 anchor words are placed along the circumference of this circle. The words shown in this circle correspond to the words that we use for the interpersonal circle for teachers, and the words in brackets are the counterparts that we use for the interpersonal circle for students. Now that I've explained the principle of agency and communion and the interpersonal circle, I can move to explaining the second principle, the interpersonal complementarity principle. Interpersonal complementarity is a general term to describe the ways in which interactional behavior of two or more people fits together and influences each other. This principle can be used to predict outcomes of interactions based on the degree of agency communion in the sequential behaviors of interaction partners. Because a person's interpersonal behavior is never random, but is contingent upon interpersonal behavior of the other person with whom he or she is interacting. In terms of agency, interpersonal complementarity is expressed as oppositeness, which means that behavior high in agency elicits behavior low in agency of the interaction partner. With regard to communion, interpersonal complementarity expresses itself as sameness, which means that if someone is friendly, high in communion, the interaction partner will most likely show similar behavior and will also be friendly towards the other person. To illustrate this, the most likely reaction to imposing teacher behavior is withdrawn student behavior. But to helpful teacher behavior, the most likely behavior of students is collaborative behavior. In my own study, I observed interactions of teachers and students during the first 10 minutes of the lesson. Every half second, I recorded the degree of agency and communion for the teacher and the class separately. This resulted in 4 time series of act-by-act behavioral data that I could combine together to visualize the degree of complementarity in their interactions. Here I presented those visualizations for one teacher with his students. The solid line represents the teacher's level of agency and communion, and the dotted line represents the class level of agency and communion. The graph on the top shows complementarity on the communion dimension. The teacher and class have similar levels of communion, and fluctuations in this level of communion fairly move together, showing a pattern of sameness throughout this 10 minutes of interaction. The bottom graph shows complementarity on the agency dimension. It is very clear that at moments where the class level of agency is high, the teacher's level of agency is low, and the other way around, showing a pattern of oppositeness throughout this interaction. Thus, for both dimensions, we can say that the interaction between this teacher and class followed the principle of complementarity. Theoretically, it's stated that interactions that follow the complementarity principle should result in good relationships. For this teacher, this is indeed the case. However, in several studies, it has been found that interactions that follow the complementarity principle do not necessarily result in good relationships, or that interactions between people with good relationships do not follow the interpersonal complementarity principle all the time. Some interpersonal theorists attributed such deviation from the principle of complementarity to status differences between the interaction partners. Teachers and students are the perfect example of interaction partners that differ in status. The teacher is more knowledgeable and therefore has a higher status than the students who should be learning from this teacher. In my own study, we have found that teachers who have good relationships with students sometimes show deviations from complementarity, and this deviation is characterized as acomplementarity, or another deviation that we saw is characterized as anti-complementarity. Acomplementarity means that one of the dimensions interactions are not following interpersonal complementarity. For example, when the teacher is helpful and the students supportive. On both dimensions, there is sameness in this example. Or when the teacher is helpful and the students are dissatisfied. Then there's oppositeness on both dimensions. The principle of complementarity, as well as acomplementarity and anti-complementarity, can be continuously used by teachers to change student behavior, for example, to improve negative interactions. Anti-complementarity is that there is no complementarity on both dimensions, so sameness on agency dimension and oppositeness on the communion dimension. To use this complementarity principle as a tool, I will now give an example of how a teacher can do this. In a situation where the students become confrontational or critical, which is located in part D of this interpersonal circle, the complementarity reaction of the teacher would be to become dissatisfied, which is lower in agency and similar in communion than the students. This would probably result in destructive or coercive interactions. One can imagine that this is not an ideal interaction in an educational context where students should be learning from the teacher in a safe and constructive environment. In order to re-establish or improve the interaction, a teacher can do multiple things to change student behavior. The most intuitive action of a teacher may be to become confrontational or imposing themselves. This is an acomplementarity reaction, because there's sameness on both dimensions. However, this may result in more hostility and negativity, because students will remain hostile towards the teacher. One could therefore think that this is not very professional behavior of the teacher. Another acomplementarity reaction that may that a teacher may show could be to become more understanding or compliant, which may improve the atmosphere because the students are invited by the teacher to also become friendly again. This is the complementary reaction. Depending on the situation, this changes in an interaction that can be sufficient to continue with the lesson. However, the teacher can also become more directing and helpful with considering the complementarity principle should result in students becoming collaborative and reliant again. If you would like to change your own interpersonal behavior, for example to improve your teacher-student relationship or the atmosphere in the classroom, try to consciously incorporate this complementarity principle in your behavior. Note, however, that if this relationship is already stabilized, this change may be quite difficult, but not impossible. Make sure to keep trying. If you are interested in learning more about complementarity, I would like to refer you to the sources that are presented on this slide. Thank you for listening.